My family tried to break me, but I used strategy and won. A true story of overcoming. I don't even know where to begin. My name is Lucio, I'm 35 years old, and today I feel more alive and, in a way, freer than ever. But getting here took everything I had for years. I spent my entire life carrying the weight of a family that never seemed to see what I was doing or appreciate my achievements. I was always the responsible son, the one who studied, worked, served the country, and built something of my own. Meanwhile, my brother Jorge, 3 years younger, was always the favorite, pampered by my mother Ana and tolerated by my father Jose. He never had to fight for anything, and I always had to carry the weight of both, until the day everything changed. I woke up that morning with a strange feeling, a mix of exhaustion, anger, and suddenly clarity. Something inside me clicked. I realized I could no longer be the family's money reserve, that I could no longer allow my life to be manipulated emotionally and financially by Jorge and his girlfriend Olivia, a woman who had no regard or ethics, only self-interest. For years, I ignored the signs, gave in to requests, and excused behavior, thinking I was helping. But that day, I saw clearly. If I continued the way I was, there would be nothing left of me but exhaustion and resentment. And it was in that moment that a decision took shape within me. I was going to change everything. Not impulsively, not by yelling or fighting, but strategically. I sat in the living room, alone, and began to think about every absurd request for money, every emotional blackmail, every document Jorge tried to manipulate to benefit himself at my expense. I remembered all the times my mother pressured me using guilt and manipulation, and how my father always remained passive, ignoring the problems or thinking everything would resolve itself. Anger began to boil, mixed with a deep exhaustion, but along with it came a clarity I hadn't felt. In years, I could turn the tables. I could make them feel the consequences of their actions, not with hatred, but by letting life itself teach them. It was at that moment I realized I didn't need to carry the guilt of being harsh with them. It wasn't selfish to want to protect my life, my business, my integrity. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that there was a way to free myself without destroying myself. The fear was there, of course. Fear of losing family contact, fear of causing irreversible conflicts, fear that they would try to retaliate even further. But there was something stronger than fear: determination. I had built my life with effort, sweat, and sacrifice, and I couldn't allow years of work to be destroyed by the irresponsibility of others. Every detail began to fall into place in my head: how I could protect my business, how I could document all attempts at fraud, how I could let life's justice take its course without having to sully myself with personal revenge. For the first time, I realized that strategic intelligence and discipline could overcome emotional manipulation and self-interest. And this realization gave me a strength that seemed invincible at that moment. I began mentally listing all the steps I needed to take. First, gather evidence without exposing myself, so that everything would be clear and undeniable. Second, let their actions have natural consequences without me having to confront them directly. Third, establish firm boundaries, which until then I'd hesitated to set for fear of hurting my mother or causing a rift with my brother. And there, sitting alone, I realized that what I was feeling wasn't blind rage, but clarity. I'd realized it wasn't wrong to want to protect my life. I'd realized that the justice of life could be more effective than any emotional argument. And in that moment, I felt ready to act. My heart was pounding, not with anxiety, but with energy, with a strength I hadn't felt in years. It was strange to feel anger and hope mixed together, but it drove me. Finally, I felt I could turn the tables without losing my temper, without losing myself emotionally, without having to fight with anyone. I could be firm, strategic, and fair. For the first time, I didn't feel alone, even though I was alone in the room. It was as if something inside me had awakened, a part that had always been disciplined and intelligent, but for years had been stifled by family favoritism and manipulation. There, in that moment, something shifted. I would no longer be exploited. I would no longer be a victim. And even without knowing exactly how everything would unfold, I felt a clarity that brought a rare kind of peace, the feeling that I was finally in control of my life. After that morning, I felt as if something had shifted within me, but not dramatically or explosively. It was more a sense of responsibility that finally clicked. I began to observe everything with a watchful eye, as if every action Jorge and Olivia made were a chess piece. Every request for money, every apology, every emotional blackmail my mother offered, it all registered in my mind. It wasn't hatred that drove me, but the clarity that I needed to protect my life and my business. For the first time, I realized I could use the discipline I learned in the army and the patience I'd built as an entrepreneur to handle the situation strategically, without letting myself be deceived or manipulated. I felt a mix of anger, exhaustion, and determination, but strangely, also a quiet peace, as if I were finally establishing boundaries that I'd needed to establish for years. I remembered how Jorge always got what he wanted. How many times had I given in out of guilt or fear of displeasing my mother? How many times had Olivia manipulated situations, leaving me humiliated or embarrassed, all to maintain her comfortable lifestyle at my expense? The pain of exploitation was, and coupled with the frustration of realizing it too late. But it wasn't time to wallow in it. It was time to act. I took a deep breath and began to consider my next steps. Every move needed to be calculated. I couldn't fail. It wasn't just about money or business, but about respect and boundaries. For the first time, I realized I no longer needed to apologize for protecting myself. I decided to start discreetly, collecting evidence in an organized manner. Documents, messages, every attempt at manipulation or fraud needed to be recorded. I knew that at any moment it might be necessary to present solid evidence, but not as revenge, but rather so they could face the natural consequences of their actions. The feeling of taking control over the situation gave me strength, something I hadn't felt in years. I began to feel confident, as if I was finally acting not just for myself, but to establish a barrier that would ensure my life and work were respected. My initial anger turned to clarity and focus. As I analyzed each detail, I realized that part of my pain stemmed from trying to please everyone, even when they hurt me. I spent years carrying guilt that wasn't mine. My mother, Anna, with all the affection she seemed to give, constantly manipulated me emotionally, and my father, Jose, remained passive, unaware of the true impact of his actions. Every favor granted to my brother seemed to legitimize his irresponsibility. I, who had always been responsible, ended up paying the price. But that day, I decided that would change. I would act firmly, set clear boundaries, and finally free myself from the cycle of exploitation and manipulation. At that moment, I also felt the loneliness that had come with me. The feeling that no one truly understood what I was going through, that everyone only saw my younger brother as a priority. But this loneliness didn't paralyze me. On the contrary, it gave me energy. It was as if I had finally understood that my responsibility was to myself, and that my emotional and financial freedom was worth any conflict or discomfort that might arise. For the first time, I felt confident that I could change the game without losing my integrity, without giving in to blind rage. And this confidence was what propelled me to take the next step, decisively and consciously. After deciding I wouldn't be manipulated any longer, I began putting my plan into action. First, I organized everything quietly. Messages, requests for money, evidence of attempted fraud, and suspicious documents were stored in secure files without anyone noticing. A sense of control began to emerge, but so did tension. Every step had to be calculated. I knew that if any detail slipped, everything could become complicated. Adrenaline mixed with anger kept me alert, and at the same time, I felt a deep exhaustion from so many years of carrying this responsibility alone. But there was a force driving me. I was finally acting for myself, not to please anyone. As I worked, I thought about Olivia and Jorge. Their every manipulation began to be analyzed coldly, without emotion. For the first time, I was able to separate familial affection from exploitation. It wasn't hatred, it was clarity. I saw that all the years of trying to please and give in had only fueled their abusive behavior. And in that moment, I realized there was no turning back. I needed to protect myself. My priority was my business, my life, and my mental health. I took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of relief and tension, aware that I was about to confront my own family, but strategically and fairly. The time had come to act, not to confront them directly, but to initiate small measures to protect my resources. Suspicious transfers were stopped, clear boundaries were communicated, and I began to expose small truths, letting reality reveal itself. The feeling of empowerment was immense, but also frightening. I feared my mother and father's reaction, but I realized they needed to face the impact of their own mistakes. For the first time, I felt I could free myself from the guilt I'd carried for years for prioritizing my own safety and my future. The hardest part was dealing with the emotions. Each step brought back memories of years of frustration, injustice, and pent-up anger. My heart was pounding, a mix of fear, anxiety, and a strange sense of justice being served. The tension was almost physical, but there was also clarity. For the first time, I felt that my intelligence, discipline, and patience were sufficient to handle the situation. I didn't need to yell, I didn't need to humiliate anyone. I just needed to act strategically, document, create barriers, and let life itself show the consequences of their actions. At the end of the day, I sat alone, exhausted but with a clear mind. For the first time in years, I felt in control. Feelings of fear and despair still lingered, but mixed with concrete hope. I could protect my job, my independence, and my emotional balance. And for the first time, I felt that life's justice didn't require my heavy hand. My patience and strategy were enough. I knew nothing would be easy, but I was ready to face the consequences, knowing that I had finally taken the first real step toward freeing myself from family exploitation. In the days that followed, I began to notice the effects of my actions, and the feeling was strange but liberating. Jorge began to experience financial difficulties he'd never experienced before. I'd wake up wondering how he'd react, without needing to directly intervene. Olivia, always confident and manipulative, began to realize she could no longer control anything. The power she believed she had was fading, and this was reflected in their behavior. Tension, nervousness, small mistakes that betrayed desperation. I felt a mixture of suppressed anger and relief because finally the manipulation had clear limits, and I no longer needed to exhaust myself to maintain unrealistic expectations. My mother, Anna, began to realize that favoritism had real consequences. She didn't need dramatic confrontations. She just needed reality to show itself. Seeing Jorge face problems that had previously been invisible to him brought a strange feeling, almost of justice. It wasn't pleasure for his suffering, but relief that the lesson was finally being learned the right way. My father, Jose, passive as always, began to see the gravity of the situations, without me needing to point fingers. It was as if life itself was making everyone reflect on the mistakes they'd made over the years. Meanwhile, I felt a tremendous clarity about my life and my limits. Every time I received a request for help that I would have previously responded to, I would mentally respond, "No more." I had established emotional and financial boundaries. This brought peace, but also a tremendous sense of responsibility. I needed to remain calm, not let pride or anger consume me, and continue to act strategically. It was incredible to realize that for the first time I could prioritize my life without feeling guilty, without fear of hurting someone who abused my trust. The most liberating moment was watching Olivia lose the security she'd always had. Seeing that her lifestyle of manipulation no longer worked gave me a sense of quiet justice. I didn't need to confront her, humiliate her, or exact direct revenge. I simply created clear boundaries and let the natural consequences of her actions unfold. The feeling of power without personal destruction was unprecedented for me. Each strategic step made me feel lighter, more in control, more alive. The tension and pain I'd felt for years began to transform into learning and strength. By the end of that period, I realized there was no turning back. Jorge would face bankruptcy, Olivia would lose control, and my parents finally began to reflect on their roles. I was no longer the family's financial reserve. I was someone with clear boundaries, emotional strength, and strategic vision. For the first time, I felt that my effort and sacrifice had not been in vain. The transformation that began on that pivotal day was coming to fruition. I was freeing myself from exploitation, favoritism, and manipulation, and that in itself was a victory that filled me with hope and confidence in the future. Looking back today, I realize how much that moment of clarity changed my life. My name is Lucio. I'm 35 years old, and I've never felt so alive as I do now, after facing my own family's manipulation. Jorge lost the security of always depending on me, Olivia lost the control she thought she had over everyone and my life, and my parents began to see, albeit belatedly, the consequences of their favoritism and omissions. I didn't need direct confrontation, just patience, discipline, and strategy. The sense of silent justice brought me peace. For the first time, I feel that my choices and limits have been respected and that my life is finally mine. The freedom I felt was accompanied by profound relief. For years, I carried guilt, frustration, and anger, trying to please and maintain family peace, while my brother and his girlfriend abused my trust. That morning, when I decided to act strategically, was the turning point. I realized I didn't need to carry all the world's problems, nor sacrifice myself to maintain the illusion of family harmony. I learned that setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's about emotional survival and self-respect. And that justice doesn't always need my direct hand. It manifests itself when we let life take its course with clarity and integrity. Today, I can look at Jorge with a mixture of compassion and firmness. He learned his lesson the hard way, but the necessary one. Olivia went on her way, taking with her what she thought she could control, but without being able to manipulate my life again. My relationship with my parents has changed. It's distant, but based on respect and a sense of responsibility. The weight of guilt I've carried for years has finally lifted. The feeling of emotional and financial empowerment is something I've never experienced before, and I know that part of this victory is the result of the moment of decision and clarity I had on that crucial day. If I had to summarize what I've learned, I'd say that life teaches us differently. For me, it took reaching the limit of emotional exhaustion and financial exploitation to realize I could act without losing my integrity. Clarity, discipline, and strategy were my tools to transform fear and anger into freedom and control. Today, my life is lighter, my business is protected, and above all, my mind is at peace. The feeling of having turned things around is unique, even though the scars and memories still linger. Finally, I share this here because I know many people experience similar situations, being exploited by family members, partners, or loved ones. It is possible to free yourself, set boundaries, and reclaim your life. It's not easy. It requires courage and discipline, but the feeling of freedom and silent justice makes up for every fear faced. My moment of transformation was unique, painful, and liberating, and today I can say that, despite everything, I prevailed. I learned to prioritize my life, protect my work, and above all, respect my limits. Today, I am free,